In Vienna's 8th district, a plaque identifies an apartment building where Dr. Wilhelm Reich once lived and worked. In the Wilmersdorf section of Berlin, there's a commemorative plaque as well. And until it disappeared or was stolen, one in Oslo. And in America, a stone building that once housed Reich's library and laboratory in Rangeley, Maine, is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Four days before the outbreak of World War II, Dr. Wilhelm Reich, an Austrian psychiatrist, research physician, and prominent anti-Nazi, arrived in New York. 3 months earlier in Oslo, Reich had dismantled his biological laboratory and shipped it ahead of him to New York. And as Wilhelm Reich's old world was collapsing, safe in the new world, he settled in the Forest Hill section of New York City, where he resumed his cancer research. By the end of 1939, after 4 months in America, Wilhelm Reich had much to be hopeful about: his promising cancer experiments and his renewed contact with his daughters. But what Reich did not know was that only a few months after his arrival, he was being investigated by the State Department because of false claims made by confidential sources that he'd been a paid communist agent. Over the next 7 years, 3 more government agencies would investigate him, and Reich, whose publications had been banned by both the Communist and Nazi parties in Europe, would live to see his publications banned and burned by order of a federal court in America. Although Reich never belonged to the Communist Party in America, he had been a significant figure in left-wing movements in Europe that opposed Nazism and fascism.
In 1927, you had a great uprising in Vienna with the burning of the Palace of Justice, a public demonstration where many people got shot.
The demonstration was triggered by the acquittal of several right-wing monarchists accused of firing into a Socialist Party rally, killing a man and an 8-year-old boy.
A verdict resulting in a riot that Wilhelm Reich witnessed.
Wilhelm Reich, Zeuge.
Reich war eben dort.
Reich happened to be right there and witnessed police shooting at demonstrators, later asking himself how that could happen, since both sides were of the working class.
Seiten sind es eigentlich Arbeiter.
Why would one worker fire on another?
Ein Arbeiter auf dem anderen, ja. Und
This radicalized him politically. That very same day, he joined either a socialist physicians organization or possibly a physicians group affiliated with the Communist Party.
oder die kommunistische Partei.
The uprising left 82 dead and over 600 wounded. As a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, Reich was deeply troubled by the irrationality of the demonstrators, the police, and the political leaders.
Reich was interested in the whole mass psychology of the demonstration that he witnessed.
2 weeks later, he discussed his concerns with his mentor, Dr. Sigmund Freud, who had written about group psychology several years earlier.
The relationship between Freud and Reich is, in itself, a very interesting one.
Wilhelm Reich was, without doubt, one of the very central pupils of Sigmund Freud in his generation.
He was admitted into the Psychoanalytic Association in 1920 while still a student in Vienna.
By 1927, however, his relationship with Freud and the Psychoanalytic Association had already begun to cool. Being radicalized into a left-wing physicians group was the start of his public anti-fascist activities, which would lead to significant upheavals with Freud. But from early on, Reich was never a stranger to upheavals. Wilhelm Reich was born in 1897 in Galicia, in the northeastern corner of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He grew up in an assimilated Jewish family in Bukovina, what is today Western Ukraine.
We know that Reich had a traumatic life, terrible losses in his early life.
He had a big trauma in his youth when he told his father that his mother was having an affair with his tutor.
He felt responsible for his mother's death.
That's a big trauma which you carry for the rest of your life.
Reich was 13 when his mother committed suicide. 4 years later, his father died of tuberculosis, and several months after that, World War I began. Within days, Russian troops swept across the border into Bukovina. Reich narrowly escaped being taken to Russia as a hostage and fled south. Later he wrote, "I never saw either my homeland or my possessions again. Of a well-to-do past, nothing was left." Reich joined the Austrian army and, between 1916 and 1918, served on the Italian front 3 times, rising in the ranks from corporal to lieutenant to company commander. On the front, he came face to face with the inhumanity of war and its machine-like nature. The experience would remain with him for the rest of his life.
He arrives in Vienna practically a pauper.
These years, the end of World War I and the end of the Habsburg monarchy, were a time of tremendous change. The monarchy had lasted over 6 centuries, and in one fell swoop, it no longer existed. In Vienna, there were armed bands on the left and on the right of the political spectrum.
In January 1919, Reich began medical school at the University of Vienna, where he met Otto Fenischel, a 4th-year student with a deep interest in psychoanalysis.
Fenischel had already attended lectures by Freud at the university, so was a bit more advanced intellectually.
Fenischel was very much interested in the question of sexuality that was not so much discussed in the university, in medical school.
Sexuality was also central to Reich's thinking. In his diary that first semester, he wrote, "My observations of myself and others have led me to the conviction that sexuality is the core around which all social life, as well as the inner spiritual life of the individual, revolves." And because the medical school offered no courses in sexology, Fenischel and several students had organized their own sexology seminar.
It's through Fenischel and his study group at the university that Reich is first introduced to psychoanalysis.
Unimpressed with most of the student discussions, Reich embarked on an ambitious agenda of reading the leading sexology literature of the day. He later wrote that it was 2 volumes by Freud which determined his choice of profession. But, he added, before signing myself over to psychoanalysis, I acquired a general knowledge of natural science and natural philosophy. I was impelled to do this by my interest in the basic theme of sexuality. What he found most impressive about Freud was his concrete and scientific thinking about the libido.
Freud, from the 1890s onward, had postulated the existence of something called libido that he envisioned as the real physical something that was going on behind psychic drives.
This was what distinguished him from all other psychologists, and that was the natural scientific principle of energy, libido.
Where does the impulse to have sex come from? Is there some chemical reaction in the body, or is there some kind of a transformation of energy from one form into another?
That libido theory hooked up, for the first time in the history of science, psychology with natural science. Until Freud, psychology was something beyond natural science.
Freud, because of his background in laboratory science, assumed that what was behind psychic impulses was something we should surely be able to study and measure in a laboratory.
During his second semester, Reich became the leader of the sexology seminar and went to some of Vienna's pioneers in the field to secure literature for his fellow medical students. Freud's personality, he said, made the strongest and most lasting impression.
Why I went to Freud in 1919, I read his things and I saw what he did. Yes, so I went to him. There was immediate contact. He had an aliveness which a usual human being doesn't have. Yes, his eyes were good. He looked right straight, you know. He didn't have any pose. I just told him that we are medical students, that we find that there's no curriculum on sexology in the medical schools whatsoever, that I, with my colleagues, want to correct that situation, yes, and that we want his help. And he was very ready to do so. He said, it's very important, it's crucial to have it. It's a neglected subject.
Freud is very supportive of him. Freud sends him patients even before he's finished medical school.
I began to analyze. I had my first patient, I think, in March 1920. I didn't take any money.
The whole idea in psychoanalysis was to make forbidden sexual urges conscious, to show the person that what's at the heart of their symptom is a repressed sexuality.
Psychoanalysis worked with a word, and with an unconscious idea. That's its tool, which is handling of associations, word images.
Simply to let the patient free associate and for the analyst to make interpretations at a certain point.
But Reich soon realized that free association alone had its limitations.
There was a problem, a dilemma about what to do when the associations didn't come. The patient was silent, the patient repeated things over and over again, the patient talked about things which may have been on his or her mind, but obviously not very important or relevant to the treatment. But what do you do?
Another problem Reich discovered was that even when he succeeded in making his patients conscious of their sexual repressions, their neurotic symptoms often persisted, which made him question why psychoanalysis seldom produced any real cure. During his last semester of medical school, Reich married Annie Pink. 5 years younger than Reich, Annie was also a medical student and a former patient of his. Within a few years, they would have 2 daughters. And like Reich, Annie would become a prominent psychoanalyst. After graduating from medical school, Reich's interest in schizophrenia drew him to postgraduate work in neuropsychiatry at the University of Vienna Clinic. Its head was Julius Wagner Joreg, who went on to win the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1927. Thus, by the age of 25, Reich had the distinction of having studied with both the father of psychoanalysis and with one of the world's premier neuropsychiatrists. That same year, he also began working at the newly established Psychoanalytic Polyclinic, also known as the Ambulatorium.
The staff there was mainly unpaid and worked with the poorer classes.
Ordinary people coming with sexual problems, with medical problems, with psychiatric problems.
Reich's wide range of patient experience made him increasingly aware of the shortcomings of Freudian techniques.
His patients weren't getting well, at least not to the extent that he thought was necessary. And of course, he already had, certain ideas about what was necessary.
One of these ideas was the creation of a technical seminar to discuss case histories and to improve and standardize therapeutic techniques where few had existed.
I brought in the idea of the technical seminar. That was the first of its kind in psychoanalysis. And I had discussed it with Freud, and he liked it very much. And that was really the birthplace of the modern psychoanalytic technique.
But even with improved techniques, making patients conscious of their sexual repressions still did not necessarily eliminate their neurotic symptoms, for which Freud had an explanation.
Freud says that it's biology, that humans have something like a self-destructive death instinct.
Reich did not have this idea that neurosis was inevitable. Freud had the idea.
Reich concluded that curing neurotic symptoms required more than just making patients conscious of their sexual repressions.
The more they were able to develop a healthy and happy relationship with a partner, the more rapidly and completely their neurotic symptoms diminished.
Consequently, Reich began to recognize the therapeutic significance of the most intimate human experience, the orgasm.
So the prerequisite for emotional health is the capacity to experience an orgasm, which is a convulsion of the entire body musculature.
Reich called this capacity to experience complete orgasm orgastic potency, a concept he introduced in a paper at the Congress of the International Psychoanalytic Association in 1924.
Orgastic potency is the focus, the aim of treatment.
Opening up to the movement of energy, to the flow of energy, whatever that energy might be, within the body.
It's not just about how much you have sex. It's about whether, when you have sex, it's gratifying and discharges the built-up energy. Rarely do summaries of Reich's work take the trouble to actually lay that out in detail enough so that people understand the difference between orgastic potency and having sex all the time, or being really sexually active.
What I mean is primary emotional experience of the merger of two organisms. Not the embrace in itself, not the intercourse. It is a real emotional experience of the loss of your ego, of your whole spiritual self in that experience.
But Reich's concept of orgastic potency as the therapeutic goal conflicted directly with Freud's ideas about the libido.
Freud's idea of libido was that it was something that could never be satisfied. And not only couldn't it be satisfied, but it's better that it not be satisfied because civilization would crumble.
I'm always astonished when I listen to such things or read it. That's nonsense, perfect nonsense.
One of his central studies as a psychiatrist was called The Function of the Orgasm, and he wrote it in 1926 and gave it to Freud on his 70th birthday. What is kind of like the apex of sexuality? It's the orgasm. Reich went there as a first pioneer.
He's a superb expounder of his theories. There's just a headlong quality to his writing.
He articulated the orgasm theory for the first time.
That there's some kind of physical measurable energy or chemical substance or something that builds up, and the energy behind drives that became neurotic seemed to be the energy of sexual excitation that didn't get discharged the way it should have.
And that with the establishment of orgastic potency, the energy source of the neurosis is done away with.
Freud didn't really go for this idea.
Also die Freud-Reich-Beziehung hat...
The Freud-Reich relationship suffers its first blow when Freud reacts to Reich's function of the orgasm
und nicht sehr begeistert.
with reluctance and muted enthusiasm.
Despite Freud's misgivings, as editor of the International Psychoanalytic Press, he agreed to publish it the following year. Reich's theories about the significance of the orgasm and of orgastic potency would become the cornerstones of his work. and tragically would become the most misunderstood and distorted aspects of his legacy. Six months after The Function of the Orgasm was published, Reich witnessed the burning of the Palace of Justice in Vienna and became radicalized.
Then I went out where the people were, 1927, 1928, 1929, 1930, and I began to be interested in Marx, Engels. I had to, of course. They are very great men.
For Reich, the insights that Marxism brought to the human condition were as fundamental as those of psychoanalysis. He observed that just as Marxism made man conscious of the laws of economics and the exploitation of the working class, psychoanalysis made man conscious of society's repression of sex. From his therapeutic work and from studying case histories, Reich concluded that sexual disturbance and neuroses were widely prevalent like an epidemic and were caused by a variety of repressive social influences. He was now convinced that individual therapy had very limited scope, that the focus should be on preventing widespread neuroses, which meant changing repressive social conditions, changes that might best be achieved through the Communist Party. Freud, however, disapproved of Reich's radical ideas about preventing neuroses, telling him, "It is not the task of psychoanalysis to save the world."
And Reich was also envied by a lot of the older analysts in Vienna. Many of them talked ill of him to Freud behind his back, and he knew this, so eventually he thinks Berlin is a better turf.
In Vienna, the Communist Party was a small splinter group.
Wilhelm Reich in Berlin.
In Berlin, Wilhelm Reich simply saw more opportunity to expand and intensify his sexual political activities and could expect more support there.
Before moving to Berlin in 1930, he met with Freud for what would be the last time. A meeting he recalled 2 decades later in his study in Rangeley, Maine. Reich was now 33 years old. He and Annie would soon be leaving their friends and colleagues in Vienna. Over the next 2.5 years in Germany, his life, both personally and professionally, would undergo profound transformation.
Aber Deutschland wird bestehen. Wir werden sterben, aber Deutschland muss leben. Jetzt und
Shortly before he arrived, the Nazis had become the second strongest party in Germany, and it was clear which way things were heading.
There were confrontations everywhere, between the left and the right, communists and Nazis.
In Berlin, Reich very quickly becomes a member of the Communist Party, which was interested in creating a sexual reform organization of its own.
Und das will Reich.
The party's official newspaper, Die Rote Fahne, was quick to report that Reich had joined Berlin's Communist Party and taken part in street skirmishes.
Also erst im November 1930 ist er.
So he'd arrived in Berlin in November 1930, and by January of 31, his name showed up in police reports tracking potential enemies of the state.
Und seitdem
It's well documented that from then on, his movements were closely monitored.
Seine Vorträge.
And then there were his lectures at Marsch, the Marxist Workers' University.
diese marxistische Arbeit.
The Marxist School for Workers held about 2,000 events a year, attended by about 7,000 participants each quarter.
Also als Besucher hin in
It was a huge institution with branches in a lot of German cities.
ganz vielen deutschen Städten. Also andere Dozenten waren, die da auftraten, waren Albert Einstein, ja.
Albert Einstein was one of its lecturers. Reich was deeply involved there and within a short time became one of its most important lecturers.
Gründete
He founded Sexpol, an educational youth organization with about 10,000 members. hoping to recruit young people for the revolution through sexual political issues.
Junge Leute für die Revolution gewinnen zu können.
Aber die KPD wollte ganz offen.
But it was obvious the Communist Party was interested only in attracting voters and understood that sexuality was a way to score points and recruit the politically uninvolved. That's why they were interested in Reich. They certainly never wanted what he wanted.
Das heißt, das, was Reich eigentlich wollte, wollten die, glaube ich, nie.
A key example of the party's ambivalence toward Reich was its reluctance in 1931 to publish his manuscript, The Sexual Struggle of Youth. A candid discussion of reproduction, sexual tension and satisfaction, the effects of social conditions on the sexuality of youth, and other issues. In Moscow, the Central Youth Committee kept postponing its publication, and so, in early 1932, Reich founded his own private press. Meanwhile, his personal life was about to change significantly. While marching in the 1932 May Day demonstration, Reich met Elsa Lindenberg, a 26-year-old dancer with the City Opera of Berlin. Soon, they became romantically involved.
They were both in the communist movement. She was interested in his psychoanalytic ideas.
Even after Reich told Annie of this relationship, they stayed together with their daughters. But Elsa was to become the great love of Reich's life.
She gives him new knowledge about the body, bodily movement, dancing, breathing, the body as a biological pulsating entity.
In fact, several years earlier in Vienna, Reich had already been focusing on the body language of his patients in a therapeutic approach he called character analysis.
He thought of therapy already in a much more global sense. It involved the character. It involved a person's behavior. It involved, in the end, it involved the body.
People in psychoanalysis had just been paying attention to words, but not to the body.
Whereas Freud opened up the whole world of unconscious mind, thought, desires, and so on, I succeeded in going further. Character analysis developed a reading of expression. Character analysis is wordless, without words.
Naturally, Reich placed an increasing emphasis on the soma, physiology, life science, body tension. All that interested him. He was a pioneer of body therapy.
In the 1920s, there was no such word as psychosomatic.
That the body and the mind really are only two faces of the coin itself. Neither one represents the coin. And Reich had the ability to see that very clearly.
He would see the facial expression, the eye expression, the general body attitude, how freely the chest was moving, patients' postures, the way they spoke, the tone of voice, the way they walked.
Reich observed that these personal and physical attitudes were expressions of hidden and repressed emotions. He called these expressions character armor and muscular armor.
Reich paid a lot of attention to these postures and these expressions.
Nonverbal aspects of behavior. And he was not only paying attention to them, but he was beginning to work with them.
One goes to the part of the body that is held in tension in order to repress emotions. And when one works physically on that part of the body, emotions are evoked, often that one never had suspicion of their existence.
So if you could eliminate the armor, then the organism would be functioning in a healthy way.
So it's a much more direct way of getting at who one is than through exploring the unconscious.
At the end of 1932, Reich finished his manuscript about character analysis, and in January 1933, Freud agreed to publish it. By this time, Reich had fallen out of favor with the German Communist Party, despite his many anti-Nazi speeches and lectures. Because of his book for young people, which he'd published privately, his publications and activities were now banned within the party.
Als dann
When an article appeared in the Nazi press in March 1933 attacking him in his book, The Sexual Struggle of Youth, he knew it was time to return to Vienna.
Wilhelm Reich needed to flee Berlin at that time because he was, the Nazis would have killed him for his outspokenness.
But the Vienna to which Reich returned was now embroiled in its own political turmoil. The right-wing government had just dissolved the parliament, and Freud, whose principal goal was preserving psychoanalysis in fascist Europe, distanced himself further from Reich by abruptly canceling the publication of Character Analysis.
Reich is clearly frustrated because it's not a political book, even though he was well known as a communist psychoanalyst. This was not in any way a political book. It was a book on psychoanalytic technique.
Freud also forbid Reich from lecturing to any communist or socialist groups. And on a personal note, Reich's marriage to Annie was effectively over. So, when Tage Philipsen, a Danish physician, invited him to Denmark to train him and other physicians in character analysis, Reich traveled to Copenhagen. Annie and their daughters remained in Vienna. Within months of his arrival in Copenhagen, Reich self-published Character Analysis, which Freud had canceled, and The Mass Psychology of Fascism, two of his most famous books.
It's a milestone in the history of the research of the authoritarian personality. Fascism is so successful, he said, because it seizes, manipulates, and takes advantage of the average character structure of the oppressed masses. Takes advantage of their longing for a strong leader, their longing for salvation. That's the whole theory of the authoritarian personality that Reich laid out. It's also interesting to note, this book includes very early criticism of Stalinism. Reich says these techniques succeed solely because this character already exists. National Socialists didn't create it. They expose and skillfully exploit it.
Reich war weltweit.
Reich was the only psychoanalyst in the world, at least until 1940, to offer a factual and critical repudiation of National Socialism and fascism, many times, not only through his Mass Psychology of Fascism, but through a variety of other books and articles he wrote in Scandinavia.
In Denmark, Reich also worked out the theoretical framework for a series of laboratory experiments using human subjects in an attempt to measure the emotions of sexuality.
One of the central issues that absorbed him was trying to answer the question that Freud had posed but never been able to answer himself. What is the nature of libido as a real physical something? And how, in a laboratory, can we measure it, demonstrate what its nature is, and quantify it?
I had to hold on to the libido theory. It's a natural scientific principle of energy, quantity, and objective functioning. And it led on into the physiological realm.
Reich imagines that at least one thing that's going on in sex is a friction phenomenon between biological membranes. And might that mean that an electrical phenomenon is an important part of the process? Eventually, he ends up with what he sometimes refers to as the orgasm formula. Mechanical tension, followed by bioelectrical charge, followed by bioelectrical discharge, followed by the mechanical relaxation of the organs. That's the orgasm formula. Now, could I prove that in a laboratory? People had previously done bioelectrical measurements on the skin surface, but no work had been done on specifically measuring the electrical charge at the surface of the erogenous zones.
Significantly, Reich was now calling the libido life energy, a concept that would become central to his research over the next few years.
In the summer of 1934, when he is in exile from the Nazis, one of his patients comes to be Harald Schjelderup, the head of the Psychological Institute at Oslo University in Norway. And he offers Reich the opportunity to carry out the kind of experiments that he's envisioning in a physiology lab at Oslo University.
That same summer, Reich was also preparing a paper to deliver at the upcoming International Psychoanalytic Congress in Lucerne, Switzerland.
The Psychoanalytic Conference at Lucerne in 1934 was the 13th international conference.
And it's a very complicated topic within the history of psychoanalysis.
And it was probably the most conflict-ridden and most difficult conference of them all.
Everything was falling somehow already apart in Europe with the Nazi regime in Germany.
Freud was still hoping for some kind of deal with the Third Reich so that psychoanalysis would at least go on existing in Germany.
And as a Jew and a communist, Reich was clearly a liability.
The two leaders of the International Psychoanalytic Association, the president Ernest Jones and secretary Anna Freud, clearly agree Reich has to go.
Reich invited the children to come to Denmark for the summer, where he was living under an assumed name. My mother thought Elsa was beautiful, and Elsa was a dancer. Eva loved her and found her very kind, and that Reich and Elsa got along very well together. My mother has had a wonderful memory of that summer, of just frolicking, playing on the beach, and music and wonderful food. Denmark was a joyous time for Eva and for Laurie. There were wonderful memories of the camping and feeling so happy to be with their father, who seemed very happy. But once they got to Lucerne, then everything kind of blew up.
So, Lucerne 34, Reich arrives from his Scandinavian exile. It's a very interesting and very complex story.
On the first day, Karl Müller-Braunschweig of the Berlin Society informs Reich that he's expelled from the Berlin Society.
He was completely shocked. Up until this point, he didn't know anything about this. And based on the existing bylaws, this meant he was no longer a member of the International Association. The one possibility of getting readmitted was if the Norwegians, who were awaiting accreditation, allowed him to join their group, which they wanted to do. But Jones went to them and said, listen, you'll get your accreditation, but not if you accept Reich.
Wenn ihr eine Anerkennung haben wollt, kriegt die, aber nicht, wenn den Reich aufnimmt.
In his 3-volume biography of Sigmund Freud, Ernest Jones says that the 1934 Lucerne Conference was when Wilhelm Reich resigned from the Psychoanalytic Association, which is, of course, not true.
15 years later, a rumor went around in New York to the effect that I had gone completely crazy and that I had put up a tent in the lobby of the hotel. It was true I lived in a tent, but not in the lobby, you see. And it was true I had a dagger, but not at the convention.
Those were the kinds of stories being circulated. So in that regard, Lucerne was kind of a tragic story.
Psychoanalysis survives in Nazi Germany by adapting to the regime and accommodating. And eventually the leader, Karl Müller-Braunschweig, and others signed their letters with Heil Hitler and so on. Wilhelm Reich comes to Norway in October 1934. It's kind of a small-town community compared to what he is used to in Vienna and Berlin. That will cause some surprises for him.
Reich immediately focused on training Norwegian psychoanalysts in character analysis and preparing his bioelectrical experiments on human subjects at an Oslo University laboratory.
He had to spend mostly out of his own income some thousands of dollars to have Siemens, the electrical equipment manufacturer in Berlin, specialty manufacture an instrument for this set of experiments.
The experiments were clearly one of the first attempts at bringing psychoanalysis onto a level of empirical validation.
It's very pioneering research.
In these experiments, electrodes were placed on skin surfaces of a test subject's erogenous zones and connected by wire leads to an oscillograph, which measured the variations of electrical current.
To try to stimulate different emotional states, Reich came up with a number of different kinds of stimuli.
Different forms of experience of pleasure or unpleasure. The experience of sugar or salt on the tongue.
Stroking of the skin with a cotton ball, or occasionally with a fingertip.
They measured 2 test subjects while kissing.
He would burst a paper bag or a balloon in order to get a start reaction, an anxiety reaction.
They measured states of arousal on the nipples, the sexual organs.
And the most consistent pattern in the experiments was any kind of a stimulus that produced pleasure made the bioelectrical potential of the surface of the skin at one of these erogenous zones go up. And any of the different stimuli he presented that produced anxiety caused a more or less sudden decrease. Reich felt that the bioelectric experiments strongly confirmed his orgasm formula. So it occurred to him almost immediately to ask, how general is this orgasm formula? Does it apply to other organisms, microorganisms like an amoeba?
According to established science, spores from the air would produce amoeba in grass decaying in water. But Reich's experiments, which he subsequently documented in time-lapse films, revealed a biological process that contradicted this long-held doctrine.
What he saw instead was that as the blades of dead grass or hay soaked up in water over days, they began to gradually disintegrate into these tiny little vesicles, these little bubble-like structures that were about the size of bacteria. And after a week or 10 days, this clump of vesicles looked indistinguishable from an amoeba, and Reich thought to himself, can it really be possible? Amoebas forming directly from dead plant material, like a disintegrating blade of grass? And these films make it pretty clear that there's never any dropping into the fluid of cysts or spores. The vesicles he called bions, some kind of transitional form between dead material and living material, elementary units of life.
The development of these bions, even under sterile conditions, contradicted Louis Pasteur's 19th century experiments, which were considered proof that living matter cannot survive sterilizations above 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Further experiments revealed that other sterilized materials dissolved in water also broke down into bions. Significantly, some of these bions displayed a strong biological effect in killing or immobilizing bacteria.
Reich early on developed a hunch that a lot of degenerative diseases in people might be proceeding by a process very similar to that which had taken place when that grass or hay slowly degenerated in water and produced as one of its byproducts amoeba.
His intuition about the development of amoeba and diseases soon became more concrete.
He went to a conference on cancer in November 1936 and saw a film there that had been made by an English researcher who looked, including using time-lapse photography, at live cancer tissue under the microscope and filmed it. And he was stunned.
In his diary, Reich wrote, "Saw a film on cancer yesterday. No doubt about it, I'm right. Migratory cancer cells are amoebic formations. Now money is a must. Cancer the main issue in every respect." At the same time, Reich, who no longer considered himself a psychoanalyst, was also developing character analysis into what he now called vegetotherapy. because of the vegetative sensations patients felt when deeply repressed emotions were manually released during therapy.
He formulated the notion of muscular armor, and he divides the armoring into segments, and he correlates these segments roughly with different kinds of emotional experiences, and he works out a general scheme of how to approach the muscular armor. Roughly, it starts with the eye segment, which has to do with contact with reality, and then the mouth segment, which has to do with oral aggression.
You get in there and you start pressing the masseter muscle, which is painful.
And then down to the neck and the chest, where you have things like stubbornness. The chest has a special position in Reich's scheme because it's the source of oxygen for the blood.
He was working with the body and with breathing as one of the important techniques.
And then down to the diaphragm and the abdomen and the pelvis.
Eventually, the patient feels things in his pelvic segment, in the genitals, not necessarily sexual sensation, but sensation in those areas that he didn't before.
Reich's ideas were so new, so radical, that I don't think the psychoanalyst could follow him.
You know, by then he was already far afield from the analyst, because analysts would never, ever have done such a thing. I mean, one didn't touch patients.
In late 1936, the implications of bions for cancer research impelled Reich to bring his work to the attention of other scientists. Among them was Professor Roger Dutheil in France.
Roger Dutheil taught at the Mediterranean University Center in Nice in southern France. He read some of Reich's earlier work, including the bioelectric experiments, became very interested in what Reich was doing, and struck up a correspondence with him.
A month after seeing that English cancer film, Reich wrote Dutheil about his latest experiments.
And when Reich told him about the bion experiments, Dutheil offered to do replication of the experiments. Reich eagerly took him up on the offer, and most of the experiments that Reich sent Dutheil the information for, Dutheil was able to successfully replicate in Nice.
By now, Reich had procured another microscope, the Reichert Z, with even higher magnifications than the powerful microscope he was already using. Since many scientists insisted that bions were just air germ infections whose motility could be explained by external factors, higher magnifications were required to observe the bion's inner pulsation, which Reich felt proved that these were, in fact, specific living microorganisms. In March 1937, he applied to the Rockefeller Foundation in Paris for funding for his bion research, specifically citing the medical possibilities of these experiments.
In the life sciences, the Rockefeller Foundation was practically the only game in town. There was an old boy network, essentially, and he's an outsider. He's Jewish and a flamboyant psychoanalyst and Marxist. So, perhaps not surprisingly, a number of scientists in Oslo who had never been to Reich's lab, when asked by the Rockefeller Foundation, "What do you think about this?" said, "We think this is worthless and that Reich is a charlatan." And as a result, Reich's Rockefeller Foundation grant application was turned down fairly quickly.
Undeterred, Reich continued his research, which included his procurement of live cancer tissue from various Oslo hospitals.
Because it was there where you really saw the clumping together of the bions, the formation of independent free-living protozoa, or cancer cells. So Reich emphasized the tremendous importance of looking at cells and tissues in the living state, a thing that cancer pathology to this day rarely undertakes.
Meanwhile, in France, Professor Dutheil's interest in continuing to replicate Reich's experiments had grown considerably.
Dutheil came to Reich's lab for about 2 weeks in July and August of 1937, studied in detail the making of a dozen different kinds of bion preparations, and Reich lent him one of the Reichert research microscopes to take to the French Academy of Sciences in Paris and do a demonstration. And almost to a person, the scientists who were present at this demonstration in Paris, some of them pretty big guns from the French Academy of Sciences and the French Academy of Medicine, said they saw exactly what Reich described, including unmistakable pulsatory movement at higher magnifications.
Still, many scientists continued to doubt that bions were genuine living microorganisms. In the laboratory, however, Reich's focus on the similarities of bions and cancer cells only deepened.
So he began to think not just in terms of possibly being able to explain the cancer process, but also possibly of being able to come up with a therapeutic method that used bions as some kind of a cancer therapy.
Because certain bions that were packet-shaped could kill bacteria and cancer cells, Reich wanted to test their possible effects on cancer in mice. He called these microorganisms PA bions.
He found that these PA bions, if he injected them into cancer mice, had the greatest effect on sick animals, prolonging their lifespan and causing the tumors, to some extent, to be disintegrated.
In the fall of 1937, and again in the spring of 1938, Reich became the subject of two vicious newspaper campaigns in which dozens of articles appeared denouncing his scientific and therapeutic work.
All sorts of claims came up, whether he was a scientist or not, whether he was mad or not, what he was up to, whether he was a sexual swindler, filthy Jew with sexual ideas and so on, running a brothel.
The Oslo press campaign attracted so much attention to the French scientists who had been involved in early attempts to replicate Reich's bion experiments that they didn't want their name associated with replicating these experiments. The mainstream narrative that has circulated about Reich is that when he wandered over into laboratory physiology and then into microbiology, he was way out of his depth, and that at best you should consider his science naive and mistaken, and maybe at worst, outright pseudoscience. If what's happening in the laboratory notebooks corresponds to what happens in the published account, that's pretty good evidence that he wasn't imagining what he saw. I think that once and for all we can stop talking about whether this is pseudoscience.
The devastating effects of the two Norwegian press campaigns, coupled with the worsening political situation throughout Europe, convinced him that once again he needed to move, this time to America.
At the time he was actively planning his emigration to the United States, perhaps the most interesting and in some ways the strangest of all the bion experiments unfolded.
In January 1939, a laboratory assistant mistakenly heated up a container of sea sand while demonstrating what should have been a routine bion experiment.
And interestingly enough, when the culture was observed under the microscope, it had some very striking novel features compared to any previous kind of bion culture he had seen. He called them SAPA bions, sand packet, abbreviated into an acronym. When he put them on a slide next to cancer cells, they paralyzed the cancer cells almost instantaneously.
He also observed other effects of these bions, such as magnetizing metal instruments, inflammation of his eyes, and fogging photographic plates, leading him to believe that these bions were emitting some kind of radiation. In his diary, Reich wrote excitedly, "SAPA bions, radiation, a completely new world." The question now was, what kind of radiation was this?
In trying to understand whether it was or wasn't related to electromagnetic fields of radiation, one of the most important tools that Reich employed was a Faraday cage, essentially just a large enclosure lined with metal. The only way you could isolate the area that you were studying from electromagnetic fields going on all around you was to enclose it in a metal enclosure. Reich had a room-sized Faraday cage in his basement, and he found that if you had many cultures contained within the cage for many days or weeks, a lot of the effects were much more pronounced and easy to measure.
By March 1939, Reich believed that this radiation was not electromagnetic, that it was, in fact, a new form of energy, which was the life energy of all living substances. He named it orgone energy.
He says, partly because its discovery was initiated by his investigation of the function of the orgasm, and partly because its most noticeable and different property was it was capable of charging organic substances.
During this time, Reich was also trying to secure a teaching visa that would make possible his emigration to America. His friend, renowned anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, a professor at Smith College in America, helped him obtain a position at the New School for Social Research in New York. Now 42 years old, Wilhelm Reich was about to leave for his 6th country in 9 years. By now, he and Elsa were living separately. She had decided not to accompany him to America.
Reich leaves Norway on the boat the Stavanger Fjord, which arrives in America 4 days before the outbreak of the World War.
My dear Elsa, there was a lump in my throat when I thought of everything that I was leaving behind, especially you. Elsa, I loved you very, very much indeed. Farewell. The man who stepped off the ship in New York was, in many ways, a profoundly different man than he'd been in Europe.
I think when Reich left Norway, he felt quite gutted, increasingly embittered, and you can see that he is a changed man when he comes to the United States.
In America, Reich would never be the public, political, or psychoanalytic figure that he'd been in Europe. He would never be politically active in the United States, nor would he have any contact with the American psychiatric or psychoanalytic associations, where rumors and slanders about him had already taken root, principally from 2 European psychoanalysts who had emigrated to America before him, Sándor Radó and Otto Fenichel, his friend from medical school.
They started spreading rumors about him, that he had gone to a mental asylum or something, and other examples that are well documented.
It was Radó. He was the one who started that rumor, and Fenichel picked it up. And the rumor was that I was in a mental institution. I was, never have. And then others picked it up. It all preceded me. Here, in the United States, everybody thought I was psychotic.
It's quite amazing, really, that he managed to build up another institute in America and to gather a new group of medical men around him.
In America, however, Reich's body-oriented vegetotherapy was never his primary focus, as he made clear in a letter to a colleague. I'm looking forward to expanding my research work, but fear the drudgery of analysis. Within weeks of his arrival, Reich resumed his cancer research, re-establishing his laboratory in a house he rented in the Forest Hills section of New York City. By December, he achieved a significant breakthrough during his first orgone radiation experiments on cancer mice. On December 16th, he injected sapobions into a mouse with a breast tumor the size of a large bean. Over the next few days, he recorded that the tumor was now shrinking. 6 days after the SAPA injection, he wrote that the bions had reduced the mouse's cancer by half. Over the next few months, Reich injected sapobions into over 100 cancer mice with tumors. In some cases, the tumors receded and disappeared completely. In others, they receded but then grew larger. Overall, the cancer mice injected with sapobions lived longer than the untreated mice. However, all the mice ultimately died. This was depressing, Reich later wrote, yet the fact had been established that the orgone has an effect on cancer tumors. In contrast to this promising research, lies and innuendos about Reich had made their way to the State Department and the FBI. 3.5 months after his arrival in America, and 9 days before his first cancer mice experiment, a consul in the State Department sent a memo to the Secretary of State with information from confidential sources believed reliable concerning the communistic activities of Wilhelm Reich. These confidential sources claimed that Reich had been a paid communist agent in Austria, which was incorrect. Also incorrect was their claim that Reich had been expelled from Austria. A month later, the State Department sent this information to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who forwarded it to a special agent in New York. 8 weeks later, this agent reported back to Hoover that a confidential informant had disclosed that Reich was on the medical advisory board of the Communist Party of America, which was also incorrect. Reich was never involved with any political party or movement in America. This would be the first of several FBI investigations. Reich was now teaching at the New School for Social Research in Manhattan and living with 30-year-old Ilse Ohlendorf, like him, a European emigre, who became one of his laboratory assistants in his bion and cancer research. As in Oslo, this research included efforts to isolate and study the visual effects of orgone energy from SAPA bions by using large and small Faraday cages.
His experiments about the properties of the radiation had led him to see that not only was it absorbed very effectively by insulating materials, but metals quickly reflected it, so they didn't hold on to it. And he thought, this is really interesting. Perhaps if I surround a Faraday cage with a layer of insulating material, fiberglass, cardboard, wood, maybe that will help keep the phenomenon enclosed within it so that I can see it better. And when he tried that, it did happen that way. He also got the idea that perhaps if I design a small one of these with a magnifying lens, it'll be dark in there. And when he did that, he found that indeed it was easier to study the cultures in a small metal enclosure than before. However, when he took the cultures out of the metal enclosures, he was rather startled to discover that many of the kinds of visual impressions were still present, and he was really rather puzzled by this.
Even when he dismantled, ventilated, and reassembled the boxes, he still observed the radiation phenomenon inside. Where did it come from, he wondered. He'd find his answer to this a few weeks later during a vacation that he and Ilse Ohlendorf took to New England.
He had found Rangeley just by accident. He had first rented a cottage over on the bigger lake, Mooslik-Maguntik, the Indian name.
It was in the skies over this lake one night where Reich made what he considered his greatest discovery. Looking through a tube with a magnifying lens, Reich saw the same flickering and flashing in the night sky that he'd seen in the boxes. From this, he concluded that this radiation existed in the atmosphere and was therefore everywhere. This discovery meant that these boxes were actually attracting and holding in atmospheric orgone energy.
This Faraday cage was what he now understood to be, as he called it, an orgone energy accumulator. Eventually, he created accumulators of a size that mice could be put into and tried this as a means of delivering the radiation directly to mice with a tumor, and found that the effects on prolonging the lifespan of cancer mice were greater than any of the bion injection experiments.
Reich also observed that electroscopes, which measure electrical charge, discharge more slowly inside orgone accumulators than they do in open air. Consequently, they became valuable tools for measuring the higher concentrations of orgone energy within the accumulators. Further evidence of a tangible energy within the enclosures was the fact that temperatures above the accumulators were frequently higher than in the surrounding air. As Reich continued to quantitatively measure orgone energy in the accumulators, he also ordered the construction of the first human-sized accumulator, approximately 5 feet high, 2.5 feet wide, and 3 feet deep, which he and co-workers sat in regularly to observe any effects.
All of his co-workers were supposed to sit in the orgone box in case there should be a bad result. We should know about it first, which is very decent of him, I thought.
It wasn't more than a few months before the orgone energy experiments had taken on such large significance in his work that he reached out for the first time to Albert Einstein to get a physicist's professional opinion on what this all might mean. Einstein responded with great interest, and in early January of 1941, Reich was enthused to find himself invited to come to Princeton and demonstrate to Einstein some of the phenomena that he had found.
Reich and Einstein met twice in early 1941. At Einstein's request, Reich left him a small accumulator so that he could study some of the manifestations of orgone radiation, including the temperature difference above the box and in the surrounding air. 8 days later, Reich received a letter from Einstein with a far different explanation for the temperature difference than the existence of an energy within the enclosure, a conclusion which Reich subsequently refuted in a series of controlled experiments. He sent these findings to Einstein in a 26-page letter. Much to his disappointment, Einstein never responded. But by then, Reich was already taking a major step forward: the orgone energy treatment of humans with cancer.
The results with mice were so promising in the first months of the experiments in late 1940 that by the spring of 1941, Reich was ready to try a person-sized accumulator to deliver the radiation to volunteer cancer patients who had been declared terminal by their physicians. Reich had them sign an affidavit that said, "No cure has been promised. I've paid no money. I understand that this is entirely experimental work." But from very early in the experiments, it became clear that the cancer patients being treated with the orgone energy accumulator showed a really marked improvement in their condition.
After 2 months of orgone radiation experiments with cancer patients, Reich wrote a 3-page letter to Einstein about his preliminary results. He also wrote to Alvin Johnson, president of the New School for Social Research, where Reich was finishing up his 3rd semester of teaching. Einstein never responded, but Johnson did, politely terminating Reich's teaching contract. That summer, Johnson would express his true motivations and feelings about Reich in an interview with the FBI. At the end of June, Reich left New York for his 2nd summer in Rangeley, Maine, leaving his 7 terminal cancer patients in the care of 2 physicians who were studying with him. From a lakeside cabin that he had purchased the previous year, he wrote to these patients, "I did not leave the city and you without any good reason, and not merely for pleasure purposes. I have learned so much from what you have experienced that I dare hope to be able to apply your contributions to scientific research upon other sick human beings." This research included 47 consecutive days of regular measurements of electroscopic discharge rates inside and outside of small orgone accumulators. These experiments, which Reich would repeat for years, revealed that concentrations of atmospheric orgone energy varied according to specific weather conditions and times of day. Reich reported these findings to his doctors in New York to help determine the best times for patients to use orgone accumulators. After returning to New York, Reich also reported these findings in yet another letter to Einstein, his 3rd since February. Einstein did not reply.
For people who picture Reich as some kind of a loner who crossed boundaries into disciplines in which he wasn't trained, if they took more time to understand how often Reich had reached out to professionals in other disciplines, asking for help, for advice, for collaboration. As with the Einstein exchange, it's not surprising in some ways that eventually he reached out less and less.
But Reich's deep disappointment with Einstein's silence was soon to be eclipsed by a far deeper threat to his life and work. Earlier that year, while Reich was immersed in his research, another FBI investigation had begun, once again instigated by false allegations to the State Department. By May 1941, J. Edgar Hoover's assistant had concluded that Reich is potentially a dangerous threat to internal security and asked whether we have prepared a custodial detention card on him. And in July 1941, when Reich was in Maine carrying out his promising orgone energy research, his name was added to the Justice Department's custodial detention list, meaning that should America go to war, he and over 100,000 others on the list would be taken into custody. On December 12th, at 2:30 in the morning, 2 FBI agents arrived at Reich's home and took him into custody. Along with thousands of other suspected enemy aliens, he was taken to Ellis Island, which served as a detention facility during World War II. His detention there lasted 25 days, during which time the FBI searched his house, confiscated his books, papers, and letters, and interviewed people who knew or had contact with him. In fact, throughout the year, the FBI had been interviewing people about Reich, including Alvin Johnson, who told them why he had terminated Reich. But in his earlier letter to Johnson, Reich never claimed he could cure cancer, and he had published nothing yet in America about any of his work. The day after Christmas, his 15th day of detention, Reich appeared before a 4-member Alien Enemy Board to answer questions. After the hearing, on the same day, the board recommended that Reich be released. 10 days later, he was finally freed from Ellis Island. That night at home, he wrote of his 25-day detention. I looked up every day from behind the bars to the Statue of Liberty. Her light shone brightly into a dark night. Although 1942 began on a bleak note, Reich transformed it into one of his most prolific years, starting with the publication of his first American research journal, in which the word orgone appeared in print for the first time. This was quickly followed by his new book, a scientific biography which, to the understandable confusion of some, used the same title as his 1927 book. Reich was now publishing under his new private press, whose impressive output for the next 14 years would include 7 new books and revised enlarged editions of 3 earlier titles from Europe. These publications featured what had become his guiding precept and the symbol of his thought technique of seeking a common functioning principle in what appear to be opposing forces. 1942 also marked Reich's 3rd summer in Rangeley, Maine, which led to several important turning points for his work. Herman Templeton, a fishing guide and carpenter who had built the cabin that Reich owned, had been diagnosed with cancer the previous year. At Reich's suggestion, he built himself an accumulator and used it at home, with encouraging results similar to those of Reich's cancer patients in New York. From this, Reich decided that allowing people to rent and use accumulators at home could be valuable for them and for his research. Orgone research requires very large amounts of money, he wrote. The small amounts that would come in from the orgone accumulators should, in time, not only cover the cost of their manufacture, but, if possible, the whole research work. Starting that fall in his workshop at home, Herman Templeton and his 34-year-old daughter, Clista, began building and shipping orgone accumulators for Reich. Shortly before returning to New York, Reich reflected on the Rangeley region in his diary. "I want to live in this country, to have my lab on a farm if possible, to return to my childhood farm days." 3 days later, he visited an abandoned farm on a small lake, just a few miles from his cabin.
And he managed to buy it for very little. I think it was $4,000, which he had to borrow. He wanted to be able to do his work here. The atmosphere was very conducive to doing work with orgone energy.
Reich called this property Organon. The war was also very much on Reich's mind. Back in New York, he devoted considerable time and effort to bring his medical orgone research to the attention of the National Research Council, which was soliciting civilian proposals to meet the challenges of wartime medicine. In December, the chairman of the council's Committee on Medicine turned down Reich's proposal. Over the next 2 years, Reich put together a plan to create a laboratory and research center on the farmland in Maine. In the spring of 1945, a student laboratory was built. Here, for the next several summers, in the clear, dry conditions in Maine he found so conducive for orgone research, Reich and his students from New York carried out a wide range of laboratory work. This included experiments using more powerful orgone accumulators, with as many as 20 layers of alternating organic and metallic material. And, at the age of 47, Reich had become a father again. The birth of his son Ernst Peter in 1944 would inspire him to expand his therapeutic and scientific work into studying the emotional lives of infants and children.
When my grandfather was older and had his second family with Ilse Ollendorf, he had Peter. At that time, I think he was realizing the importance of the connection between the mother and the child, and the bonding, and the father and the mother and the child.
Reich had also grown closer to his oldest daughter, Eva, who was now in medical school. Relations with both daughters had been difficult for over a decade because their mother, Annie, now a prominent New York psychoanalyst, had continually disparaged Reich and his work.
There was also an analyst who was seeing Reich's 2 children, his 2 daughters.
My mother, Eva, was placed in daily analysis with Berta Bornstein, who was a friend of Annie Reich. And from my mother's perspective, this analysis consisted of telling her or explaining to her why her father was crazy. And this went on for years.
In the summer of 1945, during her visit with her father in Maine, Eva finally told him about this. In his diary, Reich wrote, "Eva has opened her neurotic cupboard. Berta Bornstein told her that she would simply have to accept the fact that she has a sick father."
By modern standards of doing what is best for a child, I mean, that is shocking.
And as Eva became more involved in Reich and his work, she became more estranged from her mother, Annie.
Meanwhile, Reich was continually being denigrated in medical and psychoanalytic publications and by word of mouth. For example, Sergei Feidelberg, a colleague from Austria, now a physician at a New York hospital, announced at a party that Reich was running an illegal bordello. But it was this article in New Republic magazine in 1947 that would have the most far-reaching consequences. Mildred Brady was a freelance journalist with links to the Communist Party in America. This was the second critical article published in New Republic within 5 months. Many people, including Reich, believed it was part of a wider agenda of retaliation for his criticism of communism in the mass psychology of fascism. But an equally credible motive may have been Brady's long-time involvement in the consumer movement and its efforts to fight consumer fraud. In her article, one of Brady's themes was the implied fraudulence of the orgone accumulator as a cancer treatment and as a device which she wrongly stated was rented out to patients who presumably derive orgastic potency from it. Orgastic potency was the term Reich first coined in 1924 to describe a person's capacity to completely discharge biological sexual energy through orgasm. Now, 23 years later, Brady was falsely stating that Reich was renting out orgone accumulators to help patients achieve this. This article, in a reputable political magazine, began the false narrative, still alive today, of the orgone accumulator as a sex box and fraudulent cancer treatment from which Reich was profiting. Several weeks later, this article came to the attention of Dr. James Durrett of the Medical Advisory Board of the Federal Trade Commission, who forwarded it on to an official at the Food and Drug Administration with this note: "The reason I'm sending this to you is that he appears to be supplying his patients with a gadget which will capture the seemingly fantastic substance orgone." 5 weeks after that letter, Charles Wood, FDA inspector for the state of Maine, was instructed by the Boston District Office to visit Wilhelm Reich. When asked if the orgone accumulator could be classified as a device, as defined in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, Reich acknowledged that it was an experimental device for treating diseases, including cancer, used under a doctor's supervision by patients who paid according to their means. And it was these contributions that helped support Reich's research. He also provided Wood with relevant literature and arranged for him to visit Clysta Templeton, who, since her father's death 3 years earlier, had continued building and shipping accumulators for Reich. But Clysta no longer wished to be involved in this work and volunteered significant information to Wood, including the names of numerous accumulator users, with more names to come. Wood's report to the Boston office was forwarded to the FDA's Eastern Division in New York with this comment: "It appears that we have here a fraud of the first magnitude being perpetrated by a very able individual, fortified by men of science." Additional investigations quickly got underway in New York, including a visit to the Orgone Institute Press, where its bookkeeper, Lois Wyvell, reported that FDA inspectors were intent on obtaining pornographic literature and the names of accumulator users. Reich protested the pornographic nature of the inspectors' questions to prominent civil rights attorney Arthur Garfield Hayes, whose office subsequently worked with Reich to challenge FDA requests to procure accumulators for testing purposes, to secure the names of those ordering Reich's literature, and to obtain the names of all cancer patients from Reich's published case histories. Meanwhile, Inspector Wood made additional trips to Maine to investigate, resulting in his marriage to Clysta Templeton 3 months after they first met. 9 months into the investigation, an internal FDA report summarized its status thus far, including interviews with accumulator users whose names had been provided by Clysta Templeton. All persons were extremely satisfied with the results and were resentful of the government's interference with what they considered a personal matter. This did nothing, however, to diminish the FDA's concerns. Despite the contention that the accumulator is not a cure-all, some of the statements made in Reich's publications could raise false hopes among sick people, particularly sufferers of cancer. This report also provides further proof of the FDA's persistent suspicions that they were dealing with pornography. Post office authorities might be interested in the distribution of the sexual revolution on the grounds of obscene literature. The FDA's investigation would continue on and off for nearly a decade.
One way the world usually takes to kill a pioneer is to segregate him, to put him away to loneliness, so that he can't live a normal life. That's one way of breaking it. Now, I never permitted anyone to do that to me. They tried many times.
I don't think that my parents or Reich really could see the big picture of what was going to be happening. It became kind of like a war.
Reich was now experimenting with Geiger counters and discovered that when they were exposed to high concentrations of orgone energy for long periods of time, their needle pointers rotated at higher counts per minute than they did for radioactive materials. From this, Reich deduced that orgone energy might be converted into mechanical energy and used as a motor force.
I wish to make a record of a document at the Organ Institute Research Laboratories, Wilhelm Reich, MD, at Organon. Accordingly, the reaction of the impulse counter, soaked full with orgone radiation, being in a threefold cubic foot orgone accumulator, would amount to a motor force of about 20 to 30 times faster as that of atomic energy established until now.
A year later, Reich successfully powered a small Western electric motor using atmospheric orgone energy. And biological orgone energy from the body. Throughout this research, Reich reached out to the Atomic Energy Commission, hoping for their interest and assistance, just as he had reached out to Einstein years earlier. The commission never took his research seriously. In June 1948, construction began on Reich's next building at Organon, the Orgone Energy Observatory, which would include a second laboratory, observation decks, and his library and study.
I remember S.A. Collins and Sons building the building.
The first building that we built there was a laboratory. And then he decided to build his place up on the hill. And my brother built that. We got along very well with the doctor, but there was a lot of people that didn't.
They would call him a communist, they would call him a Nazi.
Or that he was a German spy.
Others thought he was bringing this sex orgy thing to the countryside.
And there were several other people who thought he was really a quack.
And then, of course, they used to say that it was a nudist colony over there.
Shortly after the building's completion, Reich notified his co-workers and students that the plan gains momentum that I stay here at Organon and do not return to New York. My work during the past few years has shifted more and more toward biophysics and physics and away from individual psychiatry.
The majority of physicians who were in training with him felt pulled an uncomfortable direction by his interest in orgone energy. I didn't feel equal to judging the validity of orgone energy.
In 1950, Reich and his family moved permanently to Organon.
Northern Korea. The president has stated that the use of the atomic bomb is being considered to halt the communist onrush inspired by Russia. His hope is that the employment of this devastating weapon will be unnecessary.
That same year, the threat of using an atomic bomb during the Korean War impelled Reich to explore the possible effects of orgone energy on nuclear radiation sickness.
I know he hoped that orgone could counteract atomic energy.
To test this, he planned to inject radioactive material into healthy laboratory mice, then place some of them into small accumulators. He procured 2 radium needles from a major supplier of radioactive material, and in a preliminary experiment, he decided to test the effects of highly concentrated orgone energy on the radium itself.
It makes sense that Reich was interested in trying to figure out, how orgone energy and the accumulator would interact and possibly be able to neutralize the radioactive material.
He put one of the radium needles into a small orgone accumulator, which he placed into the more powerful 20-layer accumulator, which was located inside a metal-lined orgone room in the student laboratory.
Apparently, putting that in a multi-layered orgone accumulator, it had some kind of reaction.
Within a short time, background counts in the orgone room and laboratory escalated dangerously, and experiments over the next few days resulted in the mice inside the laboratory dying.
My mother told me the mice all died. It was basically overnight. Things got horrible.
More ominously, co-workers standing 200 feet outside of the laboratory felt pain, pressure, and nausea.
My mother and other people got very sick, and it really was like a radiation sickness.
Reich theorized that the radium had excited the highly concentrated orgone energy within the accumulators, transforming it into a deadly energy and setting off a chain reaction.
Reich always spoke about the fact that he thought that orgone energy and nuclear energy conflicted.
Because of the dangerously high background counts in the laboratory and around the property, Reich discontinued the experiments.
A lot of them moved to apartments in town and other things, even Reich.
And it was scared us all, and they had to close the lab down. I don't know if any of this was true, but all of that I remember vividly floating around.
For over a year, Reich moved back and forth between the town and Organon. He was alarmed by the high background counts lingering there, and by dark clouds hovering over the property, which he attributed to the radium's effect on the atmospheric orgone energy. His research led to a method of cleansing the atmosphere over Organon using hollow metal pipes and water, and to the invention of a device he called the cloudbuster. Reich discovered that metal pipes, connected by hollow metal cables to water, altered the natural flow and concentration of orgone energy in the atmosphere, affecting moisture levels and cloud patterns.
This is a cloudbuster unit. It consists of 10 pipes which are fully extended. The operator operates the machine in such a manner that various functions are accomplished. If we wish to draw moisture, we lower it over the horizon. In order to destroy clouds, we draw from the center of the cloud. And in order to increase the size of clouds, we draw from the vicinity of the cloud.
What Reich called cosmic orgone engineering often involved the coordination of multiple cloudbusters, including one at his daughter Eva's farm on the Maine coast.
It wasn't just one cloudbuster in one spot, but they would have various operations, they called them, going on at the same time, kind of as a coordinated effort. They would be doing it at Organon, they would be doing it here in Hancock, New York, and there are lots and lots of records of dates and where the wind was coming from and where the flow of the energy was coming from, and then what happened and how long they did the basically stroking of the sky with the pipes.
The most well-known example of this work was in 1953, when he was hired by blueberry farmers in coastal Maine to break a drought.
Back in '53, my father and his good friend, Herbie Phillips, had a deal going with Dr. Wright to make rain.
We needed the rain because we had thousands of acres of blueberry land in the area, and they were starting to dry up.
They didn't want to have to pay the money if it wasn't going to rain. And Reich finally told them, if it rains, then I'll get paid. If it doesn't rain, then I'll have just done it as an experiment.
They set up right in this area, right here, and we watched, and they worked this for half an hour to an hour. And my father was kind of anxious, and within a half an hour to an hour, there appeared a puff of cloud. And there was another couple batches of clouds coming towards the first batch. And the doctor told him we should expect rain sometime within the next 24 hours. And later that evening, we got a good half an inch of rain or better in the area where we wanted it. And Dr. Wright had said, "Hey, don't worry, the drought has been broken now, so you'll continue to get rain the rest of the season." And we did.
By this time, the FDA's investigation from Maine to California was in its 6th year, and the rental and sale of nearly 300 orgone accumulators, now being built and shipped by S.A. Collins and Sons, was helping to support Reich's research.
If he wanted 80 of them, you had to find somebody to build them. So he came and asked us to build them, and we built them. And we built a lot. I couldn't tell you the exact amount, but we'd ship them all over the country.
Convinced of the fraudulent nature of the orgone accumulators and acting within the guidelines of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the FDA wrote up a complaint for injunction against Reich in 1954 after 7 years of investigation. This complaint declared that orgone energy is not a powerful form of energy and is non-existent. Consequently, the FDA wanted to ban the interstate shipment of accumulators and Reich's literature, which it considered labeling for a fraudulent device. FDA officials presented this complaint to Peter Mills, the U.S. Attorney for the state of Maine, for his approval. Mills had previously practiced law in the town of Farmington, 1 hour from Rangeley, and for many years had been Reich's attorney in Maine, providing legal services for him and his research organizations. Mills's name on the FDA's complaint for injunction devastated Reich, who was now required to appear in court if he wished to challenge this proposed injunction. After consulting with lawyers in New York and Maine, he declined their advice and took an unusual position that some have called brave and others have called naive. He wrote a lengthy letter to the judge, explaining that he could not appear in court because scientific matters cannot be decided upon in court. They can only be clarified by prolonged, faithful, bona fide observations in friendly exchange of opinion, never by litigation. Man's right to know, to learn, to inquire, to make bona fide errors, to investigate human emotions must, by all means, be safe if the word freedom should ever be more than an empty political slogan. I therefore submit, in the name of truth and justice, that I shall not appear in court. The judge did not accept Reich's letter as a valid legal response, and a decree of injunction was issued on default, as if Reich had never responded at all. But this decree, written by FDA officials and approved by Peter Mills, was even more excessive than the initial complaint. It ordered Reich to recall all accumulators from their current users and then to destroy them. It ordered all literature with instructions for using or assembling accumulators to be destroyed as well. This included all of Reich's published research journals and bulletins over the past 12 years. The decree also banned the distribution of 10 of Reich's books until such time as all references to orgone energy were deleted. For reasons still unclear, the FDA made no immediate effort to destroy any of these publications, which were now in storage at Organon, along with dozens of accumulators legally forbidden from being shipped across state lines. Reich was now immersed in a project he'd been planning for over a year, taking 2 cloudbusters to Arizona to test their effects on drought conditions in the desert. He placed his co-worker, Dr. Michael Silvert, in charge of Orgonon prior to leaving for 6 months in Arizona.
And we tried to draw in moisture from the Pacific over a stretch of about 200 to 250 miles. We succeeded very nicely in that the moisture in the atmosphere climbed higher and remained high. That means that the atmosphere learned how to maintain its content of moisture. By drawing in moisture from the Pacific Ocean, we saw prairie grass growing after about 3 weeks of operation in a stretch of about 50 to 60 miles.
Reich was really thinking that when he could show that he could bring rain to the desert, that the government would be thanking him, and that there would be sort of a shift in this persecution, and that people would realize how important what he was doing was. And that didn't happen.
The results in Arizona were promising, but this would not stop the final unraveling of events that was about to occur because of violations of the injunction by both Reich and Silvert. Although Reich had notified accumulator users of the injunction, he never recalled the accumulators, nor did any users offer to return them. And acting on his own while Reich was in Tucson, Dr. Silvert ordered a truckload of accumulators and literature to be moved from Orgonon across state lines to New York City, where their sales generated income for Reich's cloud-busting work in the desert. Consequently, several weeks after Reich's return from Arizona, in 1955, he and Silvert were charged with criminal contempt of court. For the next year, Reich's earnest efforts to argue scientific principles and undo his legal entanglements were completely ineffectual and often misguided. Ignoring his lawyer's advice once again, he and Dr. Silvert acted as their own lawyers at their trial in May 1956, pleading not guilty to criminal contempt of court, then freely admitting that they'd violated the injunction because they had to. In his instructions to the jury, the judge made it clear that the only issue in this trial was whether or not the injunction had been violated. The harsh prison sentence, recommended by Reich's former attorney and the FDA's lawyer, would bring an end to 4 decades of his life's work and solidify, in the eyes of the U.S. government and numerous professional organizations, the image of Wilhelm Reich as a criminal and fraud.
You know, I had made the prediction that if Reich goes to jail, he'll die there. I said it'll be like putting an eagle in a cage.
Over the next 3 months, FDA agents supervised the destruction of orgone accumulators and literature at Orgonon. And in New York City, several tons of Reich's publications were burned in a municipal garbage incinerator. Inexplicably, the FDA made a last-minute decision to also burn his books, which, according to the injunction, were only to have been withheld from circulation.
Both the FDA people and my lawyer and I drove to this place, which was really a big junk place called the Gansford. And there was a large trough down the middle of it. And that's where we threw all the books. Above, there was like claws that came down and picked them up and then just dumped into a fire. And that was it.
Wilhelm Reich is, in a sense, such a well-known figure in popular culture, but in another sense, he's not well-known.
You only have to look at the body of work that Reich did to recognize whether you agree with it or if it makes sense to your way of thinking or not, that it was really quite phenomenal work.
The fact that it is persistently continued this far after his death is remarkable.
He was sort of the father of body psychotherapy in the United States. He was also pretty astute about the mass psychology of fascism. And we might reread his book to see what's going on today.
You know, he's bringing in his mind a great truth to the world that will change the world. And he was driven to that. And he didn't let anything stop him from that. He was absolutely wedded to that. And he sacrificed everything for his work.
He may not have been an easy man personally, I think, but that does not cut into his brilliance.
The narrative about the mad scientist has somehow precluded the interesting discussions about his contributions.
There's something still about Reich which is a kind of a taboo.
Of all the losses of writing Reich's story out of history, the greatest loss, I think, would be the potentially lost important scientific and medical contributions.
I think it would be very good to deconstruct what we think we know about Wilhelm Reich. Start with his contributions in psychiatry and psychoanalysis, and ask the simple questions: who was he? What was he really onto?
The discovery of orgone energy and the development of his theory of cancer and its implications for medicine are just huge. Reich was, like many scientists, mistaken about many things. But if even one of the things that he thought was an important contribution turn out to be correct, the stakes are enormous.